One of the fascinating things about kind of going down this rabbit hole and writing this book was, even from a research perspective, was coming to the realization that I thought I had a pretty good sense of the history of this event and of these characters and of this trial and of this punishment and of this sentence and of this violence. And what I came to realize, much has been obviously written and celebrated and tormented about Christ's role and obviously his rise and his crucifixion. But again, these secondary characters who ultimately enabled this event that happened to fulfill the scriptures, so little is known not only about them and their history, but also their aftermath.
Some experts chase attention, but the smart ones build authority. You're listening to the Authority on Demand podcast, where credibility becomes your competitive advantage. Every week, we're pulling back the curtain on how founders and leaders turn expertise into inbound demand through books that position, media that converse, and strategies that actually move the needle. I'm Danielle Hutchinson, your host and Chief Creative Officer at Authority on Demand. Now, let's turn your authority into leverage. So there's a hill just outside Jerusalem. 2,000 years ago, something happened on that hill that the world has never stopped arguing about, grieving, and retelling. Today's guest has climbed real mountains through the Dolomites, Kilimanjaro, Altavia, in pursuit of understanding what a hill actually means. He spends a lifetime building things: advertising agencies, global campaigns, Super Bowl spots, a critically acclaimed Tuscan winery, and then quietly, in a dark corner surrounded by wine, dust, art, and mythology, he wrote a novel. This novel is In the Wake of Golgotha, and his name is Daniel Grace. This is going to be a great conversation all about what it means to tell the truth and ask questions about history's greatest villains. So let's get down into it. Daniel, welcome to the show. I'm
It
excited
is
to talk about it.
absolute pleasure to be here. There's quite a lead in. I feel I have big shoes to fill already.
Hey, real quick before we jump back in, if you're loving what we're doing here, hit that subscribe button and drop us a like. We're bringing you the best authors, the most real conversations, and all the writing wisdom that you didn't know you needed. So stick around, because it only gets better from here. All right, now let's get back to the conversation. Hey, I'm just going off of what I've seen and what I've learned based on researching your material. So I think it's a great way to introduce who you are to our audience. And you're not just like an author, you're an authority figure, somebody who's dabbled in a lot of different pursuits, and now we can learn from it all. But yeah, let's talk about you really quickly before the book itself.
Okay.
You've had a lot of really fascinating careers. People would consider them impossible to master, even one of them. Advertising executive, winemaker, novelist. So what's the common thread, would you say? Like, what took you through all these paths?
Well, clearly, any one of them, be it from the advertising world to the winemaking world to the literary world, all of which I would have lost my hair just with sort of climbing any of those hills. So with all three, my hair didn't stand a chance. So, the common, I think, thread or denominator between sort of all my lives, if you will, is I'm a storyteller at heart. And so kind of going back to my days as building an ad agency, right? That's storytelling. Being a winemaker, ultimately, promoting our wines globally. It's really what sells a wine is the story of the people and the place behind it. And obviously, as a writer, that's the fun part, is when you actually get to tell a story. So, at heart, I think I'm a storyteller by trade. And some who just sort of thrives in a sort of a sandbox of mythology.
A sandbox of mythology. I like that, and I guess you can kind of put it that way. Like a sandbox is kind of like creating your own story too, in a way, right?
For
So,
sure. For sure. And, and again, whether it's wine, advertising, this particular story that I'm telling, I think my inspiration is that, every story, every person, every soul, there's two sides to all of those things. And to me, I'm fascinated with sort of that underbelly and taking a second look. And again, I think that's another common denominator that sort of followed me throughout my sort of crazy, ridiculous journey.
I'm understood, right? And so it's all that storytelling aspect that came in the creation of writing this novel, then. And I guess based on the storytelling, it was very intentional the way you started the book itself. You talk about the aftermath of the big event here, not just the crucifixion, but the wake of it. So tell us a little about that. Like, why'd you choose to write from the fallout rather than the event itself?
Well, if you're starting from a point of sort of reimagining elements of the greatest story ever told, again, that's pretty overwhelming. And so, my focus wasn't necessarily on, what happened on top of the hill. And just by way of backdrop, the hill we're talking about, Golgotha, it's the also known as Calvary Hill. It's the plateau of skulls. It's where Christ was crucified. And it's really what I became fascinated with was sort of the aftermath of that event and the collateral damage of that event and who still stands and who fell under that eternal shadow of that event. And so, as a starting point, this wasn't about me telling or retelling or reimagining or reinterpreting kind of this pivotal religious tale. It was looking at these two infamous historical characters of Judas Iscariot and Pontius Pilate and reimagining their sort of timeless tumble through history, right? And I might argue that, there have been, these two characters, have been lynched by history and by culture and by art. And I think for these two characters that have become sort of abstract adjectives and almost violent verbs of betrayal and weakness, their story was worth having a second look at. And instead of sort of this whitewashing and two-dimensionality sort of their fate, I thought it was interesting to kind of retell their story in a more of a modern setting.
Right. Yeah. And I think it's really interesting to think about because for ages, I mean, literally ages, it's been told one way, right? But you're kind of putting a fresh perspective on the villain's side, or as most people would consider the villain.
Sure.
So tell us about that, like the way that you took Judas and have transformed him into what we could see in another light. He had another side of him, is what you're trying to tell us a little bit about, right?
Sure. I mean, one of the fascinating things about kind of going down this rabbit hole and writing this book was even from a research perspective, was coming to the realization that I thought I had a pretty good sense of the history of this event and of these characters, right? And of this trial and of this punishment and of this sentence and of this violence. And what I came to realize, much has been obviously written and celebrated and tormented about Christ's role and obviously his rise and his crucifixion. But again, these secondary characters who ultimately enabled this event that happened to fulfill the scriptures, so little is known not only about them and their history, but also their aftermath, right? It's a very two-dimensional sort of transaction that I found upon further consideration was kind of an easy interpretation that enabled, okay, we can just focus on this, on kind of the bright lights and the religious folklore of the aftermath. And so I wanted to re-examine their journey of how they came to Calvary Hill, how they came to Golgotha, how they came to the cross, how they came to erect the cross, how they came to take him down from the cross, and what happened to them in his aftermath. And it's a story that hasn't really been told. It's been, I think, suggested, it's been whitewashed, and I think it's been misunderstood and maligned. And I'm not necessarily saying that these characters should be celebrated. I am saying that they had very complicated paths. And, this is not an original thought, right? If you look at Nikos Kazantzakis' Last Temptation of Christ, you can even look at Andrew Lloyd Webber's Jesus Christ Superstar. There have been, many a scholar, writer, philosopher, artist that have sort of taken this sympathetic view of Judas and even Pilate. But I think it's a fascinating episode in history that's worth a re-examination.
Exactly. And it's fascinating because I feel like it's something that people do re-examine on a daily basis, right? But to take that perspective of it, to dive into the research, that's just like an entirely new challenge. And I want to dive deeper into that challenge. I mean, you've mentioned the research process. I mean, that must have been extensive. Tell us a little bit about that. Like, did you find anything completely jarring or surprising within that process, or was it?
Yes. So
Yeah.
again, I think what was so jarring and yet liberating was how little actually is known,
Mm,
and to sort of deconstruct what I thought I knew. while standing at the sort of the bottom of that hill, so to speak, to play with the analogy, was incredibly daunting. I realized it was actually incredibly liberating because it was so much of a blank canvas. And so, from a research perspective, there was a great opportunity to give these characters a much more three-dimensional, not only backstory, but more of a poetic license to look at sort of their inspiration and their path that led them to Golgotha and Calvary Hill. And then in terms of the aftermath, um, virtually nothing is written about sort of Pontius Pilate and the aftermath, right? And only really the first century historian Josephus kind of barely scratches the surface about his next 6 years in Judea. But other than that, he's a footnote after the fact. And the Judas Iscariot character, there's almost a convenient narrative that he hung himself in the shadow of Golgotha. And so, again, sort of diving deeper into sort of the whys and the whens and the whos, and what was Judas's motivation? Because, there certainly is the thought around, he did what no other could do, and that was to knowingly betray his teacher, his master, his brother, to fulfill the scriptures. If you're taking it from a sort of a theological approach and from a humanistic approach, my God, did he, many might argue that, he in many ways had the harder job. And then as such has sort of suffered this eternal damnation for this convenient narrative of he betrayed Christ. Yet, the Christ had to end up atop Golgotha on a cross. And so looking at these characters not as betrayers, but enablers of this greatest story was a really interesting opportunity.
Yeah, exactly. And it's interesting as you dive into this character and this side of him too, because you take it farther. You kind of bring it into, well, modern days as well. You speak a little bit about like modern like sentences and that sort of thing nowadays, but you also speak of Jude Issachar, who I'm kind of interested about. You call him the modern reincarnation of Judas. So tell us a little about that, and what does that say about the choice between where holiness lives in the contemporary world?
Sure. So in restaging this story, right, there's a universality about these characters and what's happening to them. And part of it is how we all carry guilt and sin and hope and hopelessness and fear and faith forward, and be it in one's own lifetime or lifetime after lifetime. And so what I wanted to do was tell their story through a series of reincarnations that put them in this modern telling. Okay. And so um, what I wanted to do was create this one character, Jude Issachar, that was this sort of contemporary iteration of Judas Iscariot, who was very aware of his past lives, his past role, his past damnations, his past betrayals, and lives with that guilt and that sin and that burden lifetime after lifetime, and struggles with redemption lifetime after lifetime. And then conversely, have this character, Peter Pfeiffer, who is this reincarnated version of Pontius Pilate, who suffers in many ways almost a crueler fate. And that's, his recurring kind of curse, if you will, is an ignorance, who's unaware of his past mistakes and his past weakness and his past enabling and his past sentencing and his past passing judgment. And it's really a modern day telling of violence and capital punishment and addiction in New York City, 2,000 years after this moment on a hill in Golgotha, that I wanted to tell this story of sort of every man's struggle with guilt and faith and fate, and hopelessness and addiction and violence, and make it less of a religious story and more of a humanistic story of a quest for redemption.
Understood. And I think by reframing it in that way and making it more so for, well, the human side of things, it almost broadens your audience, right? People who might not even know the story that well or whatever, it shows a way they can relate to it too. And it helps build you as like an authority figure, which is, conveniently enough, the podcast title today, right? So tell us about how like writing this book and doing this research might establish you as an authority in this field. And that's not to say, I mean, you've become an authority in many different fields, but tell us a little bit about how you think this is establishing in the writing world, do you think?
Interesting. So, there is a segue between wine and winemaking and the story I'm telling. And it's not hyperbole and it's not poetry. I have the incredible good fortune of sort of being a steward of land and of vineyards in Tuscany that are truly 2,000 years old. There's an old Tuscan road that splits the vineyard that dates back more than 2,000 years. These are, vineyards that were first planted by Franciscan monks 700 years ago. And so I'm toiling almost daily in these fruitful hills where I'm surrounded by this steep, humbling history. And so it is through that lens that I regard myself not only just as a steward of land and fruit and soil and all that good stuff, but a history of mythology and story. And relative to being an authority, that doesn't necessarily make me an authority on the matter, but it does make me someone who's incredibly sort of aware of our fleeting moment. Even as a farmer, you're dealing with sort of the cycle of land and fruit, and it certainly relates back to sort of the cycles of lives and souls, and be it last generation or 2,000 years ago. And so I think it's looking through that lens of knowing that there's two sides to every person and soul, and there's two sides to every story. That I think where I started to seek was just that sense of, if we're going to consider religion in this case, or history, or culture, or characters that transcend all of those, we need to take a more of a three-dimensional approach, right? And religion can often be sort of whitewashed as maybe a moral compass. And I think when considering, the crucifixion, right, it's a word that almost stings on its way out. It's a word that barely escapes the human psyche, yet alone mouth and mind. And yet, when we consider it in its role in history and religion and art, I think too often the violence surrounding it, the form of a capital punishment, is not necessarily seen through that lens. And so again, as just a consideration of the genesis of any religion, all religions, and this isn't casting judgment on any of them, and this is coming from a faith-based place. They all start on their hill in a moment of violence and betrayal. And it's a core belief that we all share that transcends the ages and cultures and religions. And so, in a roundabout way, answering a question on authority, that doesn't give me an authority to comment on those religions. But I think what it does do is it does shine a light on sort of the universality about climbing that hill, right? And having that moment of confrontation and violence and betrayal that kind of ironically unites us all.
Understood. And I like how you tied it back to that unification aspect, because especially with this type of topic, I feel there's a lot of like divides between perspectives and whatnot. But at the end of the day, you're right. I mean, like creating something like this, it does act in a unification type of way. So I think that's very
Sure.
important.
I mean, religion as it was 2,000 years ago, as it was 5,000 years ago, as it is 5 minutes ago, and right now is clearly very divisive, right? And when you talk about, Golgotha, this probably the most infamous, perhaps one of the most important hills on planet Earth that's been besieged and fought over for millennia. Our history as a species is one of violence, and the vast majority of conflict and death throughout human history is because of religion. And again, this isn't suggesting religion is neither good nor bad. It's simply an acknowledgement, right? Of this is a violent, uncomfortable story. And so to me, I think embrace that violence and discomfort and understand it and talk about manners of capital punishment, because that's what this moment on the hill and crucifixion was. It was an execution by the state of capital punishment. And I think that's just part of the historical reality of the event. And we're still struggling today with those same debates of topics of capital punishment by the state. Who passes judgment? Who gets betrayed? And so, these characters transcend, not only just the time, but the trial and the act. And I think that's really interesting. I think we oftentimes, it's easy to isolate, especially in Catholicism, this particular crucifixion on this particular hill. And yet this particular act of capital punishment and execution and passing judgment and these trials is just as applicable today in every corner of the globe. And so again, to me, it's a process of sort of de-isolation, which is fascinating.
Definitely that. And, that's why work you're doing is so important. And well, and kind of tying it back to authority, since that it says, the topic here, it's interesting because by doing so, you're establishing that platform in order to bring about this type of perspective in the world, which is, it's just so profound and important. So, yeah, I mean, if people are interested though in learning more about what you do and reading a book, where's the best place for them to find you? Because I understand you're also in the process of writing another book. So tell us about that too and where to stay connected, all of that, our next steps.
Sure. Well, the book I should lift up in the wake of
Yeah.
Golgotha, out now, published by Kohler Books. I have a website, danielmarkgrace.com. You can follow me on Instagram at danielmarkgrace. And there's news about upcoming releases and the audiobooks and the book tours and all that great stuff, updates about the follow-up book, which is in the works. It's dare I say, a similar vibe, a little bit dark, a little bit bloody, a little bit transcendent in terms of time, but it is set against the backdrop of, how do I say this, sort of tainted, stained, bloody, timeless vineyards. And it's really set against the backdrop of priceless, timeless wine coming from nameless plots of land where there are buried secrets and bloody paths. And it's those echoes and those histories and those whispers of tragedy that are captured in wine that makes it sort of this very sought after juice.
Yeah, and not only that, but you're able to kind of combine both a couple sides of what you've done in the past, which makes it really, really amazing. Write about
Well,
what you know, and what better way than to combine these different areas
ex
of expertise.
exactly. My perspective is, nothing pairs better than a beautiful blood red Sangiovese Tuscan wine with sort of a deep, dark, bloody tale about sort of man's brutal past. And so, they go well together.
And I love that. Yeah, especially that's really funny actually to think about it that way. I mean, it's kind of like, what's your favorite type of wine? But
Big,
I love that.
it's actually fascinating to see. As a sidebar, I love sort of that conversation about, because people think about pairing wine, about what they eat and the kind of mood they're in the season, right? You think about, okay, I drink rosé in the summer, and come Thanksgiving and the holidays, you're kind of getting into deep, more bold, full body red wines. I love the idea of what people pair with what they're reading, and it's really fascinating. And whether it's you kind of going deep in sort of the fantasy world, you get these sort of weird, quirky wines, or whether you're getting these kind of lighter rom-com summer beach reads, wines get sort of lighter and brighter, and then as you get into kind of darker tales, it kind of scales back to bold, darker wine.
Exactly. And that's I love the comparison. I think it's a perfect way to kind of, symbolize a conversation, right? Like, what kind of path do you take? Which wine do you want to sip from as you read the book, right? So,
Exactly.
yeah,
Exactly. And it's all very subjective.
right. But hey, while we have you guys, go ahead and check out Daniel's work. We're going to put all the links in the description box of this podcast today. So go ahead, check out In the Wake of Golgotha, and also check out the next book, Territorium, which again is coming out. And honestly, in the meantime, guys, check out Daniel's work in general. It's a very inspiring conversation we've had. And Daniel, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for your time, your story, and for reminding us that some hills are worth climbing.
Some hills are worth climbing. Thank you for having me on. This was a great chat and lovely to meet you.
Of course. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next time.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
That's a wrap on another episode of the Authority on Demand podcast. If today's conversation sparked something in you, don't keep it to yourself. Share this episode with a founder or leader who's ready to stop being the best kept secret in their industry. If you want to turn your expertise into inbound demand, head to authorityondemand.com to see how we help clients go from unknown to in demand. I'm Danielle Hutchinson, and I'll catch you on the next one. Now, go build some authority.